And thank you for your patience while we dealt with some technical difficulties. Welcome to our final session and this robust panel discussion. Thanks for joining ParentMap's Every Child Summit webinar entitled COVID-19, Atypical Learners and You. And this panel discussion will feature David Lewis, Mark Stein, and Howard Eaton. I will give you a quick bio of each, and we're going to proceed in order of having Dr. Stein first, then David Lewis, and then Howard Eaton. So Mark Stein is the director of the Pearl Clinic ADHD and Related Disorders program at Seattle Children's Hospital and an investigator at Seattle Children's Research Institute. He's also a professor of psychiatry, behavioral science, and pediatrics at the University of Washington. David Lewis is the director of behavioral health services at Seattle Public Schools, a department that focuses on educational practices that align with social emotional learning research and trauma-informed practices. Howard Eaton is the founder and director of Eaton Aerosmith, which provides atypical learners of all ages with educational life-enhancing programs. My name's Elaine Sulkin, and I am the CEO of ParentMap. I am the proud mama of 3 grown children and Bubby to a 2-month-old and a 2-year-old. So for those of you that are not familiar with ParentMap, we are a content-rich website, magazine, book publisher, and we describe our content as somewhere between broccoli and popcorn. And tonight falls more under the broccoli, health, education, wellness, and development. Nutritional popcorn, we'll say, is the fun adventure and out and about activity that you can do with your family. So check out parentmap.com. Tonight's webinar is going to be recorded, heads up to that, and we will republish it for educational and promotional use. And we also really urge you and invite you to use the Q&A prompt at the bottom of your screen so that we can feed questions at the end to the speaker. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Stein.
Hi. Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's good to be with you today. I'm going to give you a short kind of introduction to what we've been trying to learn about the effects of COVID-19 on children and learning and how that impacts children that are atypical learners. Which to me means especially children that have what we call neurobehavioral disorders, such as ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. But everybody learns in slightly different ways, so I think there are lots of applications. This has been kind of an interesting year, I guess. Starting in January with the identification of the first COVID infection in Washington. And just think about how quickly everything has changed. Seattle Public Schools closing down, at home orders, and our healthcare system trying to figure out how to address the current needs and kind of what's coming. Taking a step back, I think we can learn lessons from other kind of national or natural disasters, and 3 really come to mind. The first is 9/11, and what I think is really important to take away from 9/11 is that we were expecting children to be very significantly adversely affected by that in terms of their emotional health. We were surprised that the majority of children did quite well, but 9/11 was very difficult for parents and families. And then the other thing that we learned from 9/11 was that it wasn't the immediate effect, it was the later effect, 14 years later. And it was mostly mood and anxiety and PTSD type problems that people that were exposed to 9/11 had. Second example is Katrina, which was much shorter, in terms of, than the pandemic. But there we saw, whole social systems and school systems shut down. And there are still lasting effects of Katrina, especially in terms of the educational system. And the children that grew up, that were exposed to that, have had significant mental health problems since then, and school achievement problems. One of the things that we learned is that one of the predictors of doing well was having an informal social support network. And probably the most similar, but even before my time, was the 1919 influenza pandemic, about 100 years ago. And I think the important thing to remember about that pandemic is that it wasn't 1 year, it was about 3 to 4 years. And there was a big difference between the acute effects and the long-term effects. One of the long-term effects of that pandemic was really the identification of the forerunner of what we now call ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There were two Viennese psychiatrists, Kramer and Pollnow, who identified something called hyperkinetic reaction of childhood, which was occurring in 4 to 5-year-olds who were exposed to the influenza virus. And a lot of the symptoms overlap with what we now call ADHD. It took a while before them to publish it and to get the recognition of it, because World War II was going on and they actually had to flee Germany. But I think the point is that we don't really know the impact of COVID-19 on neurobehavioral disorders. And we may be seeing all new flavors and characteristics, in the next few years. So in thinking about the effects, I think even though we're talking about the effects on children, the effects on children are mutually dependent upon their parents, the healthcare system, and the school system. And they all kind of work together, and something like COVID-19 affects all of them. Some of the early research that's come out on COVID-19, the first research came out in China, and I think it just highlights some of the immediate impact on everyday life. Thinking about what children do when they're out of school. They're less physically active, they have more screen time, their sleep gets disturbed, their diets get worse, and all those things contribute to attention and learning and behavior problems, and our more novel interventions are actually targeting those characteristics. And I think we're already seeing quite a bit of that. I mean, the most common precipitant now for child behavior problems is being asked to terminate from technology. And in a COVID-19 socially isolated world, there aren't too many options for many parents. My colleague at Seattle Children's, Margaret Sibley, has just done a survey of the impact of COVID-19 on her patients who are adolescents with ADHD. And what she's finding is that the most common problem is really that they're reporting is an increase in social isolation, difficulty engaging in online learning, poor motivation, boredom. These are things that are common in adolescents with ADHD generally, but when you add COVID to the mix, it makes everything else worse. Some of my colleagues in Europe have come up with guidelines for how to treat ADHD during the COVID-19 pandemic. And basically they highlight the interventions that we use now, even prior to COVID-19, but stressing even more the importance of behavioral management strategies. So I'd like this quote that how behavioral parent training are an essential feature because it improves parenting, reduces oppositional behavior, and it also helps break a coercive cycle. When you have a child with ADHD in a home and you're having them do things that they don't like or they're not interested in, and it's just an awful lot for parents to try to cope with that without extra help. So parent training really addresses that difficulty, and it actually leads to more protection and safeguarding by breaking a coercive cycle. The other recommendation is that children with ADHD, if they have been on ADHD medications, that they continue, but they be adjusted to address their current duration of symptoms. And this is a really interesting study by some colleagues in Israel, and they looked at 14,000 patients that were in an electronic medical health record, and about 10% of them were positive for COVID-19. And they asked the question, what predicts getting COVID-19? And one of the biggest predictors was having ADHD. Other predictors were being obese and hypertensive, and being male, but actually having untreated ADHD. So again, the idea of someone who's impulsive and overactive and not following rules, not only is it leading to behavior problems and contributing to learning problems, but actually puts you at risk for being infected. At Seattle Children's, the biggest, in my clinic, the Pearl Clinic, in March, we went from like 1% telehealth visits to 80% telehealth visits, and now it's like 98%. So this is a huge, huge change in terms of how care is delivered. We found many benefits of telehealth. One is we're able to see people from far away, and it's also very easy to access families because they're at home. And then you take out the stress of transportation and parking. And I particularly like being able to see families in their own home. And I think you actually get a better glimpse of what children are really like. I think it's more ecologically valid. I also see patients in clinic, but I much prefer telehealth than being in clinic with masks and eyewear on. Of course, there are barriers and difficulties. We always have the connection issues. Not everybody has Wi-Fi access. But it is great that we do have more access to more people, and we have fewer no-shows, which leads to more efficiency. So putting myself in the role of a parent of a child, which I have 3 grown children and 1 grandchild also, I think it's important to recognize that as a parent during COVID, you have many conflicting roles. You're not just the parent, you're also the teacher. And most of us don't have training in being a teacher, let alone a special ed teacher and someone that has someone with ADHD or autism. And your role as teacher conflicts with the role as parent sometimes, because parents, they have a lot other things that they have to do. And then there's the issue of the parent as an individual. 20 to 30% of parents of children with ADHD have ADHD themselves. If you have ADHD or depression, especially if it's untreated, that's going to influence how you parent. And it really is important for parents to be able to take care of themselves, as well as focusing just on their children. And then everyone is dealing with the unknowns now. What's the future course of COVID-19? How is it going to impact work, schools, and the economy? So I just wrote down some quick thoughts, some generalizations. One thing I think is helpful is to strive for stability in your child's life. So every day, having a set time that you review the calendar, you go over the schedule, you go over the rules, the incentives, and you give feedback. Make that an automatic part of the day. That really helps kids. It helps orient them. At the same time, you don't want to be rigid. You want to have variability in their schedules, and you want to be realistic in setting goals. Even though we're really concerned about academic achievement, we know that it works best when you combine it with study breaks and physical activity. But it's better to have that scheduled in than to make it on the demand when the child just asks for it. It's really helpful to get feedback from other parents about how to do that. And then the taking care of yourself is so huge. I don't know how many people were on the previous webcast about being calm, but I think taking time for yourself, being realistic, and giving grace to everyone as we figure this out is really important. A big pet peeve of mine is to avoid the internet for advice. The internet is not regulated in terms of science. Rely on trusted people who know you and know your child. And that relates to the last point about how to be connected. So you're not all alone. You should be connected to your child's teachers and to their school. And if they have an IEP, you should be in contact with them about revising it. Your child's pediatrician or primary care physician should be a partner with you in addressing your child's needs, all their needs. And there's not a difference between health and mental health. They know you, they know your child, and they can give you the best balanced advice on interventions. And take advantage of the opportunities that's out there in terms of telepsychiatry and telemental health. Don't use this time to avoid treatment if there is a problem or if you have questions, because this is a good time to figure that out. So I'm probably at 10 minutes, and Shelley's going to mute, Elaine's going to mute my mic in a minute. But just to summarize, we've seen a rapid expansion in telehealth. It's very acceptable to families. All the studies show it's as effective as in live treatment. We're seeing people with ADHD and autism, we're seeing stable incidence of that. It's not increasing, but what is increasing is comorbid anxiety and mood problems that come with that in both the children and the parents. And it's just really key to develop, a support network to be able to address that. And we're just now getting a good glimpse of the acute effects, but we're going to learn more about the long-term effects. And we have to be alert to what those are, and they might be very different. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. We'll go right to David.
Yeah. So, hello everyone. David Lewis. Spend most of my time with Seattle Public Schools. I'm connected to provide either consult or support with about 11 districts at various parts across the country. So it's actually given me an opportunity to talk with various people. And, what I often say is every district is so different, but from a biological standpoint and from an environmental standpoint, the pandemic is something that's universal no matter where we're at. So, I would say in professional development or trainings or having the opportunity to have been with potentially 10,000 teachers from April through September, there's often an exercise I do on what I call a zone of anxiety scale. And in some ways, it's just a check-in to say, where are people at? So when your alarm clock goes off in the morning and you have cortisol dripping in your bloodstream to get you motivated to start off on your day, you may be in an optimal zone of a 0 to 3. As school approaches, teachers may be a little more stressed because we've got, lack of structure of the summer. We're getting into a new structured routine. We have new initiatives coming and so on. And a teacher may tell me that they're sitting at a 5. When I've done the same exercise this year, 10,000 teachers roughly have typically said a 4. That number has landed somewhere up here. And what I often say is there's a layer of stress that comes with the unpredictability of the pandemic. And, we're creatures of habit would be the soft saying, but we do look for consistency and predictability to be able to have a lower anxiety level of understanding what's coming next. And what's essentially happening is we've thrown the cards in the air and we're waiting for them to land. So as Mark stated, we want to take care of ourselves to not have us sitting in a toxic stress zone. And what one teacher said, because when we talk about teachers, we're often talking about that teacher who's teaching our young children are also a parent themselves at the same time. The teacher said, well, now I know why I'm snapping at people and going off on people, because I'm 2 points away from going off. If we have self-care in place, then the idea is that we tick these stress levels down, and the more healthy we are day to day and the more stable we are in terms of our emotions, then the more apt we are to have positive relationships with each other. What I've often said is if our teacher is sitting elevated in stress, then the child is sitting elevated in stress, and then the parent's sitting elevated in stress. If 3 months goes by and we're relating to each other from that place, after 3 months, we call that our relationship. So as a whole, we want to be aware of this and be able to take care of ourselves in this. So the idea is, the term would be emotion identification or emotion recognition. And then in what ways do we regulate that emotion? Where that would fall for children is social emotional learning, that at some point becomes social emotional intelligence to where they can manage that for themselves. There is a student somewhere that may have had outward external behaviors in a classroom, but what we were able to see at that point was a teacher who has a relationship that can physically see that, read them as they come through the door, see their smile, see not their smile, and support. We've removed some of those elements. And so many times what we've seen in schools right now is that kids will disengage, whether you are an external or an internalizer, and we want to not allow things to slip through the cracks so we can support that child and that family. And one of the skills that we've talked about probably more than anything is advocating. And what I've often said is there's a child somewhere that's frustrated about math and has a behavior attached to it, but it may not be that they have a behavior challenge. It may be that they need support with math, and teaching that child the replacement behavior of being able to advocate and ask for support. What I've said is if there's a developmental equivalent of that as that child ages up, then that's a 19-year-old advocating, knocking on a professor's door somewhere without any of us there to support it. So in what ways can we build those skills into our students and our children? So yeah, we want to keep ourselves healthy in this optimal zone. So to be here prepared tonight, make sure I have my login and everything else, I'm probably sitting at a 3 or 4 to make sure I'm prepared and motivated. And yeah, we want to think about what are the things that have our stress increase. And you know, from a biological perspective, we're all individuals as well that have our own baseline levels of anxiety. What the pandemic has done, though, is put a layer on top of that, regardless of where your baseline is at. But I know students right now that were reluctant to engage in school first period. And what they've done is if their go-to was listening to music, they put their headphones on first thing in the morning, which got them out of bed, which put them outside taking their dog for a walk and had them engaging and logging in for that first period class, and not an academic gap that could contribute to this time when we're not present in school and that somebody's not there to identify that. We look for routines. And what I often say is our traffic system is probably one of our most consistent universal things that we all fall under when we're taking the bus or public transportation or we're driving our own car, but everything is explicit. How consistent and predictable can we make our environments? Because when a child or even us knows what's coming next, there's less to worry about, which lowers our baseline anxiety level. So in what ways can we do that? What I often say is that's creating anticipatory patterns, because when we don't know what's coming next, oftentimes we want to fill the gap with something. And what we fill that gap with could be something ideal or non-ideal. And there will be a behavior or a response that follows that in some way. So in what ways can we make our daily routines still structured in a time where the environments around us aren't as structured anymore? How do we have our logins with our synchronous learning and still build in activities when things are asynchronous? Is there a way to do that each day? And some of the byproducts of this is, you know, mental health is a range. And on a given day, we could be apt to have a good day or a bad day. But when you're layering a pandemic and the inconsistencies and the stressors that may come from that, something that you want to be aware of is the way that I'm feeling now falling outside of that normal range. Because if so, we want to have recognition of that. And as Mark talked about, there are avenues to seek help to try to address that in some way. Okay. And something like depression can manifest itself inward for kids, but that can also look like irritability. And if the pandemic has created a scenario where kids and adults can become more anxious or risk for depression, then we want to be aware of our children, what they typically look like and what they look like now, having to, you know, be the experts of our children that have had them since they were infants, and then do something to be able to reach out and support in that area or that way. And yeah, if you look at our brains here, you know, the term that often gets brought up is executive functioning. And so in what ways are our children and our students able to recognize an emotion and regulate it before having a physiological response of a shutdown or an outward behavior? You know, we have a limbic system that when we're anxious, it's firing off, having us ready to respond in some way. But when we're sitting in that state, we're not thinking as well and we're not retaining information as well, which some could say we don't learn as well. The idea is that we can create conditions in school and out of school, because the kid's brain is developing 24 hours a day. And what you can allow is you can allow that limbic system to calm down and not be stressed, and allow our prefrontal cortex or executive functioning to begin developing out, to have that child on a trajectory to be academically, socially, and behaviorally healthy coming out of this still. So I've said in some talks, believe it or not, there's a child somewhere that grew 5 inches and somebody is working with them on shooting their jump shot from their head instead of their chest. And 3 years from now, when this clears up and they're on the basketball team, they'll look back at COVID and go, that wasn't an ideal year, but that's when I fixed my jump shot. There's a kid somewhere that with a family figured out a new walk to take during this to still fit exercise in. And 10 years from now, that kid may be with their family taking that same walk and look back on this year and say, it wasn't ideal. That was the year of COVID, but I still have these traditions and these time that we've spent and developed during that time that I still take with me. And so in what ways can we still promote that and promote health and promote good memories during this so that it's not something that students just look back on and have a negative association with. So, all right, thank you. I'm up on my time.
David, thank you for ending on a positive note with,
All right, good.
I appreciate it, and I'm sure everyone else does. So we'll move right over to Howard, but thank you.
Thanks, Mark and David. And thank you for the introduction. I think we're doing something really exciting in education, in special ed, and this isn't new. It's been under development for 40 years, starting with Barbara Arrowsmith-Young out of her school in Toronto, the Arrowsmith School, who took the work of Dr. Luria and Dr. Rosenzweig in relation to brain plasticity in rats and applied it to humans. And over the last 17 years, I've been engaged in this work, first as a skeptic, because I was trained at Boston University in graduate school, the brain was fixed, and learning difficulties, attention disorders were lifelong realities, and changing them was not going to be possible. And so I was in the accommodation, compensation, technology mindset for years. I did psychoeducational assessments and referred kids to schools that specialized in those types of techniques. So about 20 years ago, when I heard of her work, I was a huge skeptic. But I was open in my thinking, thank goodness, and was willing to meet with her in Vancouver, British Columbia, where we started our first school, and was impressed with her work. She was connected with researchers at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto, and she believed in research and had been conducting research. And I said, you know, let me go visit your school in Toronto. And I did. And I started seeing these exercises, these training exercises that didn't seem to have any application to reading, writing, and math. And so I was very intrigued and began to ask her 1,000,001 questions. Talk to the parents and the students and some of the researchers involved, as well as one of the most renowned psychiatrists, Dr. Norman Deutsch, who wrote the book, The Brain That Changes Itself, bestseller. Chapter 2 is about her work. So I knew there was some real legitimacy behind her work, and said, listen, Barbara, if I could take this work to Vancouver and study it at the University of British Columbia with some neuroscientists, would you be interested? And she said, absolutely, let's study it. And so we were able to connect with Dr. Lara Boyd at the University of British Columbia and Dr. Greg Rose at Southern Illinois University, all who began to study the brains of these children engaged in this program to see what was going on neurologically, and were these brains indeed changing with researchers who weren't connected to the Arrowsmith program. And so I want to talk a bit about that and what this means for online education and reaching out to children with neurodiversity, because I think it's a real paradigm shift, and I think we're getting there. We need more people involved, but it's exciting work. So I want to show some of that to you guys. So the idea around Arrowsmith is that what we do is we target a cognitive program to stimulate the brain, and the child has to have, or adult, effortful processing. So they have to really engage in the work. The research that I'll show you momentarily is that we're actually seeing structural and functional changes in the brain, mostly in the functional side, using functional MRI data. And as we see these changes, we're also doing Woodcock-Johnson measures, the measures of intelligence, and looking at achievement and cognition. And again, these are third-party academic researchers. And they're seeing changes in cognitive capacity, that we can actually improve fluid intelligence, we can improve working memory, we can improve processing speed, which in turn has an impact on academic accomplishments. If you can engage more, have better attention control or executive functioning, you're going to, of course, usually have better academic performance. But more importantly, I think really interesting as well is we see benefits social emotionally. And I think, if we step back and look at our brain is taking in all this sensory information and trying to interpret the world and work it around into our areas of the brain that interpret sensory information and concepts. And if you have trouble within these networks or in these localized areas, your interpretation of what you're seeing is not going to be as accurate as you would like, and you have confusion and uncertainty. And so a lot of children with learning difficulties struggle socially because of uncertainty, or they just can't keep up with conversation and communication. So over 23 years, there's been about 10,000 students engaged in this program, and a lot of research, 6 universities, 4 different countries, 700 students. I don't want to spend too much on this, but just to say that this is research-based. And personally, I wouldn't take this on unless it was research-based, because I have a strong belief in science. And if we look at some of the research in 2016, 2014, the idea that brain function connectivity has something to do with attention disorders or even dyslexia or dysgraphia, the science is showing, yes, it does. That if brain networks aren't connected properly, if there's some disruption or abnormality, you get learning difficulties. So the question then is, can you change that through targeted cognitive exercise? And again, this is a way to look at how remarkably wired our brain is. This is diffusion tensor imaging. It looks at white matter. There's also gray matter. So this is just a less complex view of it. But the brain has these sort of internal networks or wiring, allows us to communicate from our front of the brain to the back of the brain, different lobes in their brain. And again, if this connectivity is disrupted, say, for example, with a brain injury or brain trauma, traumatic brain injury, you get problems with, for example, executive functioning, attention, ability to have a good quality of life. But what we're seeing with learning difficulties is children who have those difficulties also have difficulties in different areas of these networks. And there's quite a few of these networks. The ones that the research we did focused on was the default mode network, dorsal attention, saliency network, frontal parietal network, and they all have different functions. One is the I'm thinking function, one is what's going on, and the other saliency is what's important to know, and frontal parietal is what should I do, how should I respond? And so the researchers we worked with at UBC, University of British Columbia, and Southern Illinois University were very interested to see what sort of things happened with our students that they engaged with. And I think, Dr. Stein and Dr. Lewis, one of the first things that we noticed, I think you'd be fascinated in, is that prior to intervention, children with learning difficulties seem to have a disengaged or less active default mode network in the prefrontal lobe. You can see that in the slide to your right. You look at the front of the brain here, you can see some lighted up areas. What we noted 3 months into the program is there was more engagement in the resting mode aspect of this measure, meaning there seemed to be more engagement in this frontal lobe. So one of the hypotheses the researchers had is all the compensations and technology and strategies we're giving children may actually not be as beneficial we think for brain development. And in fact, what we need to do is challenge that area of the brain, to engage that area of the brain so it works harder and it has more effortful processing and begins to develop more capacity. So the more we lay back and don't engage kids to actually have effortful processing, I think the outcome can be less favorable. And this is just another example of the complexity of the networks, this default mode network, the I'm thinking network. There's a lot of areas of the brain engaged in it. This was the researcher, Dr. Lara Boyd to the left, University of BC, a neuroscientist. And Barbara Arrowsmith Young on the right, the founder of the program, that's one of the exercises, the clocks exercise. You can see that's a 10-handed clock, how complex it could be in terms of reasoning. And I'll get to why clocks is one of the exercises. But again, Dr. Boyd was interested in what's happening in these children. And here's another example of once you're engaged in a sort of an intensive reasoning exercise, you can see time point 0, all the yellow is activation in the brain during the functional MRI. 3 months into this type of programming with children, you get less activation and you wonder, is that good or bad? It's essentially showing that you're becoming skilled at the task and you're using less neurological areas, less energy to understand what's going on. So again, it shows the benefit of mastering a skill and that you use less brain functioning and capacity once you've had mastery. So again, the outcomes of Dr. Boyd's research and Dr. Greg Rose was that they saw better connectivity between brain regions in these networks. And this was after 3 months and after 1 year of intervention. And those are some of the outcomes in terms of the 4 universities that were involved in this research. And again, why would social emotional outcomes be a benefit too? Well, you're just more present. You're not living in a fog. You're not living in uncertainty. If you talk to children and adults with learning difficulties, there's a great sense of uncertainty because their sensory system ability to grasp information and reason seems to be at a slower level pace than children who don't have these difficulties, which can lead to social emotional difficulties, anxiety, and depression. So it's very important that we sort of target these large scale brain networks in our work. I also noticed too that some of the kids who come in with medication for ADHD, what we're finding is their primary cause of their attention deficit is cognitive functioning problems. So for example, they're slow at processing information. They take longer to get notes on the board. Their working memory is slow. So they can't keep pace with instruction. And therefore they show symptoms of attention deficit disorder. Once you start improving these cognitive functions, the symptoms of ADHD are significantly lessened. So again, what is this program? What we do, and I think good instruction should do, is do an assessment. And if you look at the Section 504 and IEPs, you all say you should have a quality assessment to determine what program you should be engaged in. I was a teacher in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, while I was a graduate student at Boston University, and we spent a lot of time on IEPs and taking the psych-ed results from professionals and putting them in. But what I often found is that we do the assessment and we make recommendations, but it wasn't well followed up. The follow-up assessments weren't always effective. And as well, assessment to treatment, what do we do with this difficulty, wasn't well managed. And what I'm liking in terms of what I'm seeing coming out of the Arrowsmith program is the reason for the assessment is purely program-based. So they look at these cognitive areas of the brain, and then they decide, okay, we're going to implement this program for this child. And what's exciting is that we've been able to take what we're doing, for example, in Redmond, Washington, at Eaton Arrowsmith Academy. And the reason we went from Vancouver to Redmond to start a school in Redmond is Satya and Anu Nadella, Satya, the CEO of Microsoft, had his child, and he's okay with me letting people know, he has been very public about it, is he actually had his child come to our school in Vancouver because they believed in the concept of neuroplasticity and brain change, and they wanted to see if this could help their child. He was frustrated with the commute all the time. He said, Howard, would you mind starting a school in Redmond? And they're also very supportive of research and research funding. So we got into Redmond, Washington, and have been there for about 7 years. And then as Mark noted, COVID-19 hit, and all of a sudden we said, oh my God, we got to go online. And we were wondering, would this program work online? It's very intensive. These kids spend 2 to 3 years with us. This is not a program that you spend a week and you're fine, or 16 weeks and you're done. Neuroplasticity, cognitive change takes a lot of effort, a lot of time to develop abilities. And so we were concerned whether COVID-19 would cause major disruptions in programming. And what we found was in most cases, some of them actually showed improved performance because there were less peer issues, less peer disruptions, more focused attention as they were working on their program online. So we were pleasantly surprised and pleased that you can actually work with children with learning difficulties online as long as your program is targeted specifically for their needs and has incremental mastery levels of accomplishment. So they're internally motivated to engage in this work, and they're showing progress as they're moving forward. So I know that we can address a lot of these students at home if we had the right program. And the reason this is important, I feel, is that unless you work on these cognitive functions, there are lifelong issues that they face for the rest of their life. So if we just focus on accommodations and strategies, if they're moved out of the school and have to go home, all those kind of support structures are gone. And you see the true impact of neurodiversity issues and how devastating they can be on performance and capabilities. So here's one of the programs that we have. It's the CLOCS program. It's called Symbol Relations. And students are engaged in this daily, sometimes for 2 to 3 years at different levels of complexity, from 1 hand to 3 hands to 10 hands. The fMRI research we've done at universities has shown that the area of the brain that seems to be integral in CLOCS engagement in terms of reasoning is an area of the brain that integrates all our sensory information. It's called the parietal temporal occipital lobe. It's where reading comprehension engages, math problem solving engages. And the research that they showed was within 3 months of intervention, that area of the brain was much more engaged, much more active. And so here's the interesting thing that I discovered when I was in Toronto and I looked at this exercise 20 years ago. I said, how does that relate to reading comprehension or math problem solving? Well, it's the area of the brain that engages it. And whatever is surrounding or in that area will also show capabilities and improvements and advancement in skills. So if you work on this exercise, you also get advancements in reading, comprehension, and math problem solving. Sadly, they're taking analog clocks out of schools. I think that's a problem that has to be replaced by something that would challenge it. And what's at home, what we're doing with these kids, our instructors are able to actually follow students in real time. So the student is at their home, engaged in the program. Our cognitive teacher is at their home. They have a tablet that actually monitors in real time through the cloud the performance of these kids, not just their accuracy of performance, but their engagement of performance. And these are all very important in the concept of neuroplasticity and neuroplastic change. And we can monitor different things in terms of daily engagements, the level of their progress. All of this would be so great for an IEP in terms of measuring outcomes and what we're doing, all within this concept of improving cognitive capacities. And I could go on and on and on, but what I'm seeing is that we can actually provide children with learning and adults with learning difficulties, online opportunities that actually target the cognitive weaknesses that they have over time. Again, it's a 2 to 3 year progress. We can either do this on-site or online. And my hope is that over time, these types of interventions will become the norm. And I know that we have to work with compensations and strategies and technology, but I know the brain is much more capable of advancing its capabilities. And what I've seen come out of research independent of Aerosmith is very exciting. And we're also seeing these types of changes in the work I'm doing with brain injuries. So we're taking this work, this Aerosmith program, moved it into brain injury, started researching this at the University of British Columbia, and we're getting the same outcomes in that we're seeing improved brain network connectivity and improve behavioral outcomes like quality of life measures, lower anxiety, lower depression. And we've been studying that for 4 years in brain injury research. So whatever the causation of a cognitive deficit, we're seeing that the science is saying really positive things, and the outcomes of what's possible is something that makes me get up every morning and get to work on this. So I want to thank you.
Thank you. I mean, my head's exploding. We have a bunch of questions. I'm going to try and direct one to each of you. We have a bunch of audience questions, but I'm going to start with Mark and ask, what is normal anxiety during these times, and when and how should I seek help? And how can a parent identify normal anxiety versus this is really acute?
Great question. Well, I think anxiety is normal during these times. I guess a child gives clues that they're experiencing anxiety in different ways based upon their age. But I guess I expect children and parents to be anxious because there's so much uncertainty right now in their world. So much has changed. But having anxiety is a normal part of life in this stressful situation that we're all exposed to. That doesn't mean that your child has an anxiety disorder. It doesn't mean that they need therapy or medication. What would trigger, I guess, further evaluation is if you see that the anxiety is really affecting the child in their life. An example might be anxiety is so bad that they can't go to sleep at night, or they're having difficulty. They used to sleep in their own bed. Now every night they come into their parents' bed. Or they don't want to talk to people, by Zoom, or I mean, really impacting their life. Then you start to suspect, well, maybe this is more than situational normal anxiety that can be overcome with modeling and with exposure. And again, it's best to talk to someone that knows you or your child, like your child's pediatrician, about if it is worthy of more formal evaluation or treatment.
Sure, thank you. David, for you, what are important self-care practices and supports to keep in mind overall? And, the complexity of in the public schools, the number of teachers and students that are stressed, how can we most effectively take care of each other, take care of our children, and support the teachers?
Yeah, I would say, first off, you want to have some type of consistency and routines that are, and that works in school and out of school. What that does is it allows our brains, all of us, to stop worrying, which would elicit an anxiety response, and have less worry because we know what's expected and what's coming next in a given day. Some of the uncertainty and cause of anxiety, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's day-to-day school, could come down to not understanding where my link is to log on, to not understanding even the ways that we've got to technologically do this thing that we call school now. If we can create some certainty around those things that were unknown and measure our cortisol levels before and after, once it's known, our cortisol levels will more likely than not be less, right? The other thing is, I'm going to really simplify this, making sure we're naming successes for people, for the students, for the teachers, for teachers who are parents themselves. How do we create an odometer that's still positive for that kid? Because here's the thing, when a child takes on something completely brand new, and for many of them, this is new, and for many of us as adults, this is new. If you don't feel somewhat successful at this 60, 70, 80% of the time within the first 2 weeks, you're going to want to disengage from it. So in what ways can you find the strengths in this and name a success for a child? I have a pie that I show somewhere, and it has a bunch of negative messages in it, 5 million and a small sliver of positive. And I ask people, when I reverse that pie and reverse the number of messages on positive versus negative, if that's a different child, and people say yes. So in what way do we still create an odometer that's building a child's self-esteem during this? And that is the child that may be more apt to have less challenging behaviors in a time like this, because we have consistency in our environments. We still have positivity in catching them in their strengths. We're naming successes. And then we're watching the clock to see if this is going to end anytime soon. Additionally to that, what I often say too is for our brain to be able to grow, it has to feel safe, right? And the pandemic creates some emotional uncertainty, which can sometimes not feel safe, but at the same time challenged. So if we can create consistency in our homes and school, there's the place in there with clear instruction that a child can still grow and not have academic gaps or other things that we would be at risk for falling under when this ends. So, all right, thank you.
That's great. Thank you. To quote one of the good sayings of Dr. Laura Kastner just before the three of you came on, children don't really accept influence from tyrants. So the opposite of, the positivity and supporting the students' successes is key, as well as the people living in your home and teachers that you encounter. Really appreciate it. Question for you, Howard. There's a few questions around, is it ever too late to start this type of program? What are, kind of the age limits and constraints, and what are you seeing as far as impacts with older kids?
Yeah, well, I remember just in the brain injury world first, we went to a professor at the University of Washington, must have been 6 years ago, and said, hey, would you like to study brain plasticity in people with brain injury? And she said, well, how long do these people with brain injury have to engage in the program every day? And we said, well, 3 to 4 hours. And she said, oh, they'll never be able to do that. They won't be capable of focusing that long. So, and even with learning difficulties, there can be the opinion that, that we shouldn't be engaging them in sort of demanding, effortful, challenging tasks because it's too hard. And I met special educators who felt the Aerosmith program, for example, was too difficult, it was too hard for them. And again, this mindset that children and adults with learning difficulties need to have sort of an easier pathway through education is based on the fact that we don't have the right program that actually, I think, addresses the underlying causation of their struggles, which is cognitive deficits. And so we've worked with children as young as 7 years old. We've worked with adults who just wanted to advance neurological functioning who are 81 years old. The brain has plasticity through its lifetime. For certain, there are, the children age group go through rapid changes neurologically. Teenagers during specific times go through rapid explosions in neural activity. But adults can also change neurological functioning, and we've seen that with adults who just want to improve their own cognitive capacity. But more importantly, some of the research we've seen with brain injury, these are severe traumatic brain injuries that might have been 20 years ago. It might be 55 years old, out of work for the last 10 years because of severe executive functioning difficulties, foggy brain, uncertainty, same kind of symptoms that children and adults with learning difficulties face. Through 6 months of intensive cog rehab, 4 hours a day, targeting these large-scale brain networks, we've seen through imaging studies and through quality of life tracking that they're back on track. 80% are returned to work, and this is scientific-based research using controls. So it's remarkable what's possible. I'm in this not to have these private schools, but my wish one day is in public schools for free, part of their planning, part of their educational system. And hopefully Seattle Public Schools one day will look at this as something that they should engage in, for example. I think it's the future of education for this group. I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, but I'm trying to make the pioneer effort to get the work out there.
Great, thank you. And given that it's 8:39, I think we'll have the last question go to Dr. Stein and land us with some good news about what we're learning through this whole process and maybe potential benefits from the research around COVID-19 and the impact on families and learning.
Well, I'll try. I mean, I think the encouraging thing is that now there are more opportunities, for children to interact more with parents, and for parents I've seen a big change in terms of, a big issue in child psychiatry is what source of information do you have? For ADHD, we use something called the Vanderbilt. And pediatricians don't understand sometimes when a parent sees one thing and a teacher sees another. And so then they refer, our job is to help them figure out which one is valid. And I think with COVID-19, the parent actually sees children and the difficulties they're struggling with learning. So I think they're going to be more empathic with the teacher. So I think that that's positive, that there's more awareness and there's just more time because you're not traveling anywhere and you have less to do. So I think there are opportunities. And, we just worry about how much time children are engaged with technology. And I think now there's really time to be creative and to think about these new things. And as David was saying, to try to switch the ratio of positives to negatives around. And really, I think the highlight isn't that your child is a slow reader or has executive function deficits. That may be true, but really the key to helping them is finding out what they're good at and what they like. And is it music? And is it social relationships? And then really building on that. So I think that's our opportunity.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. And I want to thank you all for your time. And each one of you could have given us a good hour, but thank you for doing it as succinctly as you did. And we hope that you have a good night. And thank you to everyone who signed on and joined us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.